Hi, my name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University in St. Charles, Missouri. This is a show called Insight, and we discuss books on politics, both domestically and internationally. Sometimes historical books that provide some insight on the present, and sometimes broader trend analysis or atmospherics books that look at broader developments in how we look at political issues. Today's book is on the Donald Trump, and it's written by a man named David Frum, and the title of his book is called Trumpocracy, The Corruption of the American Republic. Now, this book isn't what I would call your traditional, let's stick it into the liberal versus conservative nonsense way of thinking, which you end up seeing you generally dominating cable news, which should hurt your eardrums. David Frum is a well-respected Republican. He worked for George Bush, the second one, the son, not the father. And he was a speechwriter for him and a senior advisor in the Bush administration. So this is a different situation than somebody yelling and screaming and hollering and saying it's some sort of make-believe liberal, and then you can easily define the term and say, okay, now as a result we know where the book is coming from. This is a very thoughtful conservative, very thoughtful Republican. Now, joining me on the show today is a Lindenwood University student, Maria Sanchez. So what I wanted to do was read a brief opening quote from the book, and then we'll jump into a discussion about what the author is saying. The author writes, "Democracy is a work in progress. So is democracy's undoing. Until the U.S. presidential election of 2016, the global decline of democracy seemed a concern for other peoples in other lands, a matter of U.S. foreign policy, yes, but not for America's internal affairs. That complacent optimism has been upended by the political rise of Donald Trump."
See, with the checks and balances the United States has in place, it has almost to a certain extent held pieces of the Democratic government together, from restraining power from Donald Trump and his administration from passing bills into effective, potentially harmful laws, which is not just exclusive to his presidency. But democracy is not just about those laws and policies themselves, as the author is underlined. It's the message, the propaganda, the beliefs Trump and his administration is standing so highly with that begins intertwining with American culture. That is, people seeing a man run his campaign with intensive distaste and almost it's hate towards certain groups of people, and then winning the uttermost respected seat in the White House. Despite having Trump on check with other branches, those messages of showing clear hate towards certain people is not stopped by official political factors. They run its course, reaching many American households, presenting essentially a cultural norm that if our president can say this, we can too, and we should carry out those messages by socially constructing barriers that impose on other people, barriers that policies sometimes cannot break or fix, and that is placing the detriments in the democracy that the author is getting at.
Yeah, he's trying to look, I think, at Trump in a broader way, because he's trying to say that Trump really exploited or took advantage of an opportunity, that there were a number of people that were already distrustful of the political process. They were distrustful of newspapers, of where they ended up getting their news, except for Fox News, because he's very critical of Fox News as a propaganda arm of the Trump administration. And he's trying to show that you came through this period called the Great Recession, and so inevitably people were still going to sort of be hurt. There were winners and losers, economically speaking. Globalism, the idea of just sort of realizing that you're involved in an international trade environment, is going to create winners and losers. And again, as a result, you look at the idea that Trump comes along. To some extent, he's a reflection of all of this trust and anger, and he sees an opportunity and he knows how to exploit it.
Yeah, as you said, Trump essentially preyed on certain Americans, as other candidates do when they run their campaign. It just happens to be at a time where it's increasing conversation in race, class, gender, culture, and sexual identity that took centuries to even discuss openly. And what people call themselves traditionalists in America sometimes makes them uncomfortable discussing these things, that because of this huge cultural change that Trump and his administration acknowledged, that there has been such a place where people are seeing this changing too fast, and he tapped on that anger that people, that my parents and grandparents and other people's grandparents have lived through this cultural change, and he was able to trigger that emotion and make those people move in a momentum that we're seeing in his reign right now.
Quote from the book, President Trump has plunged the government of the United States into chaos that enhances his personal power. He has persuaded millions of Americans to ignore information they need as fake news from a corrupt media. And so I think it's when people watch only TV news, you're going to see a sequence. We're going to tell this and this and this, and you're just going to cover in your half-an-hour evening show, which ends up maybe being 21 minutes after commercials, just a few topics. But if you're picking up a good newspaper, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and you're reading them and realizing there are several hundred articles in these papers, are we supposed to assume everything you're reading is fake news? And it isn't analyzed very well. And as a result, then, it's easy to persuade people that weren't doing a lot of reading in the first place to continue to not read and not pay attention to anything. And you're thinking, well, so the only place they're getting their news is from Sean Hannity or Tucker Carlson or Fox and Friends. On Fox station, he's very critical of these three in specific shows, as the idea that their job seems to be in no way to do anything but make sure that they act as a propaganda arm for Donald Trump.
And with that said, the author mentions the example of the Pope, where how decades ago we would have never predicted how advanced media would get and how powerful and how spreadful, and instantaneously we would be able to spread information. The Pope did not endorse Trump whatsoever. He made actually more criticism of his Christian faith, in fact. But Facebook, as I mentioned, it produced an image where Pope and the Trump were friends, and he was endorsed, and it spread, as the book mentions, millions of views. And this does extremely harmful in manipulating people's perceptions, per se, that it's just not, we're not looking more past what we're seeing on surface and technology. It's just easier for us just to believe what's in our view, and rather than just click and see whether fact checking is easily it's easily accessible, but we don't do it because it's just easier for us to just see what's on the surface and just go from there.
He doesn't sort of leave Obama when he was president out of it. He's very critical of Obama for having done something specific, which was the idea that he issues an order essentially addressing what we see of as, let's say, the dreamers, those that came here legally as kids, but they've been here for so long. You're trying to address the issue of should they someday receive citizenship for the amount of years they've been in the United States. And so Frum is very critical of the way that Obama did that. And I think what he's trying to do is then say, okay, we have Obama doing something that he did that was very overstepping his presidential authority. But the difference with Trump is that he's doing so many things in so many different directions that he sees of as sort of a major threat to democracy in a broader sense.
Yeah, the author acknowledges that going back to feeding on momentum at the time, that's just not an exception to Trump. In fact, when Obama's president in 2018, that he talks about that Obama was challenged with supporters and other political factors that were pressing on him to pass his DREAM Act in 2001 that just kept failing and failing in Congress over times. And then the times changed when in 2012, when he was running for re-election, he completely just went against his statements of his limitation on powers and produced an executive order of 2012 with the DACA Act that just as critically, people were saying he overstepped his authority and such, but it begins differing with Trump when people aren't realizing that Trump is doing the exact same thing, even to a more extremist extent, where we're seeing more and more and more executive orders, and that's what the author trying to do, as you said, is differentiating how, almost to say a media spectacle of where we're treating Obama differently than Trump, as to per se.
He sort of, I think sort of a starting point for him is that Trump received a great deal of popularity or support because of his belief that Obama was not born in the United States, so the birtherism issue, and that this birtherism forced him to be the front runner in the Republican primary to get the Republican Party nomination to run for president. And so he said party leaders personally rejected and derided the birther hoax, but they did so not loudly, and they didn't want to be heard. And so he's very critical even of Republicans for not sort of loudly saying this is sheer nonsense. And what I thought was interesting, they do mention that, well, okay, eventually Trump said, yeah, we now know he was born in the United States, let's move on. But then he doesn't analyze, which I guess I'd like to see, well, how many people heard what Trump said to now believe, oh, what do you know, then Obama was in fact a citizen of the United States, so there's no reason to believe it. But do the same number of people believe it after Trump, in a very quick way, says, yeah, he's born in the United States, let's move on now? Yeah,
it goes back to almost this treatment of how we treat different opponents and how the media projects them. Because when we look, that the book mentions was one of Trump's scandals during the election run was when the sexual assault came up across, when he had openly admitted of proudly omitting sexually assaulting a woman. But within, I believe, a 90-second video posted, he just apologized, saying that it's something that he did over a decade ago and that he's not the same man. But when you actually look at that, he's 72 right now. And he was 60 when he said it. So just basically it's adding to this American culture that boys will be boys even at 60. And when WikiLeaks surfaced Hillary Clinton's of characterizing her as a double two-faced and dishonest, the media hammered on her, extremely hammered on her, all the way to end, almost literally ruining her whole campaign. And the book does a great job of saying how media can treat different candidates depending on which one's getting more attention and which one should we avoid and which one should we completely zoom in on.
Yeah, I thought that point was very good. He developed that through the book, how you focus all this attention on Hillary Clinton's emails. A lot of them were unimportant, but just saying the term emails implies that they're all important. Yeah. And he sort of, and then here you are, a good Republican writer, sort of then questioning, well, is there something really called liberal media bias just because you keep using the term? But that essentially it was the press and television news that were really doing their most almost to help Donald Trump by the way they constantly approach Hillary Clinton's emails, but not his issues.
Yeah, it's just very, it's important how the book does that, just differentiating those perspectives to say how the media was just overlooking things just to get his name out and just promoting actually almost to a certain extent free media to him, which it goes into the Jeb Bush example he mentions, how Jeb Bush spent millions, hundreds of millions of money just to promote his name, but when Trump did his tabloids for the media, it gave him free exposure, and that made him a front runner for the Republican Party.
He talks about how the Republicans, and this predates Trump wanting to, I guess, run for president, wanted to go after the Affordable Care Act, or what became known as Obamacare, and he says the original ACA, so the Affordable Care Act, was lengthily debated, examined in committee, and fully scored by the Congressional Budget Office. And then he says, unlike Republicans, that simply they didn't have a plan. They've never had a plan, despite Trump saying we have a health care plan. Yeah. He's saying there never has been one. All they did was have an opposition to the ACA, and that was it. And what they were going to do with health care reform, they still don't have a plan, which is what he's trying to point out here.
Yeah, it's crucial how political and social momentum is, again, looking at the Affordable Care Act and its attempted repeal in 2017. It's how Republicans and Democrats almost switched roles to say they're repealing in place of the Affordable Care Act, as described by McCain, mentioned in the book, as a quick attempt to just have something for what they promised during Trump's campaign and to just swallow their doubts about it and just to smash and grab, as the author states. It's also interesting seeing the labeling of it, as well as when even Trump himself refused to call it Trump Care, but he's easily referring to Affordable Care Act as Obama to almost places negative connotation on it.
Yeah, he says the Obama years were actually a good time for the American affluent. Over President Obama's 8 years in office, the Standard & Poor's 500 gained 235%, more than 16% annually, one of the best returns in U.S. history. Yet, through those years, one heard the pounding drumbeat of discontent. The Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and the Trump campaign, and a rising tolerance for violence. And he says Donald Trump did not create the vulnerabilities he exploited. They awaited him. The irresponsibility of American leaks, the arrogance of party leaders, the insularity of the wealthy, those and more were the resources Trump used on his way to power.
Yeah, and with that, during now his presidency, he's locking down that support that ran his campaign and will most likely be the support that carries his re-election campaign. Trump knows how to speak in the way that appeals to them as evidently as he did with his sympathy towards the Confederate monuments that the book addresses, stating that sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments that he tweeted. As the author states, it's a matter of feeding onto the cultural grievances of no longer being able to be an apologetic white person in America. And in the long run, this secures their loyalty and the support for Trump. It's strategically, essentially.
Yeah, he has a chapter, he calls it The Enablers. And so basically it's about how Trump is insulated, and as a result he has people and organizations that can support him. He calls it the conservative entertainment complex that propagandizes for him, hence his, again, criticism of very precise shows on Fox. I think sort of you want to distinguish, rather than just say Fox, the whole thing. It's more very precise shows on Fox, different than, say, watching sort of a Chris Wallace doing an interview, that he's very critical of Fox and Friends, he's very critical of Sean Hannity, he's very critical of Tucker Carlson, that he sees very precise people, Ginny Perlow, that these are sort of complete suck-ups, that they have no ability to actually feel they have some obligation, even though they're not journalists, that even as sort of political commentators, they show no ability to say, well, I have some degree of ethics and honor to stand up and sort of talk in some independent way. And so he's very critical of very precise shows on Fox. And
it's hard to tell whether he's being strategic or just it shows us his lack of ability to deal with even the bare minimum of criticism, as the book goes on to with the Megyn Kelly incident, how he was just extremely critical of just Megyn Kelly, and he was refusing to go on a debate. And it's difficult to see whether he was just using it for drama attention to seek more promotion on media, or he's just really unable to deal with criticism in a general sense.
Yeah, that whole issue, you know, he determined after that debate, when she started asking him questions about, here's what you said about women, so now what do you think about him? He felt he had the complete right to tell Fox, well, I don't want her on, as though he's in charge of the
Yeah.
journalism and that he has a right to dictate what he wants to get. And so when they say, sorry, we're not going to do it, we're not going to bow to you, again showing the distinction between the Fox News part of Fox versus the propaganda parts or aspects or shows of Fox. So again, you've got sort of these two elements that both make up that station. And so what does he do off? He runs off then and does something with veterans, or what he thinks is for veterans or for servicemen, and then talks about how he did it to give money and raise money. But he doesn't when they track down and say, well, wait a minute, you said you were going to donate money.
Yeah.
He only donated it after it was revealed he hadn't donated the money when he said he had already done so. So after the fact again, and so he's trying to use that again, a way of saying, here you're looking at a very questionable character of a man in the White House.
Yeah, it's his rhetoric that is attracting these audiences, his non-political words of him going against the norm of speaking to journalists like Megyn Kelly and going against these media outlets that are attracting his voters. And it's important that the book addresses that half his voters in the study that he depicts stops at an education below or at high school education. And it's important because he's purposely using rhetoric that attracts and is able to, for their audience to understand this and essentially just continue his loyal support, and the non-political aspect of being that is he's being strategic to just appeal to them.
Yeah, I thought there was a whole section in the book where I think he's trying to show how Russian-backed organizations that managed to tap into the emails and get those emails to WikiLeaks, so that they got them to Assange, who runs WikiLeaks, that it was interesting, and he's sort of almost implying outright that, yes, the Trump administration did work with these Russian organizations, because he says, okay, you have this Access Hollywood tape, so everybody sees Donald Trump talking about how he has a right to treat women because he's a celebrity and so he can get away with anything and he'll do anything he wants. And so that he says it's within minutes after that, I think he comes up with a time of 32 minutes or something, that WikiLeaks will subsequently put on its site the Hillary Clinton emails. So within half an hour, in other words, you're distracting from the Hollywood Access Hollywood tape by what you now put about Hillary Clinton on WikiLeaks, and then the press essentially helps Donald Trump because they keep focusing then on Hillary Clinton's emails, and so completely ignore the Access Hollywood tape. So once again, here's a good Republican questioning, how can you call this liberal media bias?
Yeah, it's very, he's very aware of how the media works. As you know, he's been on The Apprentice and he's know how Hollywood works to a certain extent. He knows what attracts media attention, and he's using that concept of the media spectacle to proceed policies that sometimes are underneath the Americans' nose, and they're not aware of what's happening. But because Trump is able to distract such big audiences, even a huge mass of voters, to just completely ignore situations that he's doing, with such as the executive orders. He's been signing so many, and some of us aren't even aware of those orders that he's doing, such as the access to the Dakota pipeline is proceeding, promoting agriculture, these tax reductions and foreign trade and such on all those. It's distractions for President Trump to just proceed those executive orders.
His quote here says, Republican leaders panicked after the release of the Access Hollywood tape. WikiLeaks detonated and deflected the issue, and that saved the Trump campaign. And so that's sort of normal. There's a quote which comes in those WikiLeaks emails from Clinton. She says, a politician needs both a public position and a private position. I know from knowing an incredible number of politicians over the years, that's absolutely true, that in public they don't have the time to explain their nuances and complexities. You have to say things to an audience in a more simplified way. And this has nothing to do with a make-believe liberal or make-believe conservative, Democrat or Republican, that you want politicians to be able to understand complexity and nuance, but you can't always explain that to your audience. And when you're on television and all you're going to have is a minute and a half, there's no way to say, stop the cameras, I want an hour and a half to explain the complexity of this policy. So the idea of feeling like that was the way you got to get her because of those words, that's sort of, there's something wrong there.
Yeah, and that's what I believe led a crucial edge for Trump winning this election, was his brutal honest is so believable that to a point that I think he believes everything he's saying is exactly true and exactly his intention, which is also conflicting with Republican ideologies having to pass things such as an Affordable Care Act that was just out of blue because he promised these things that he might not understand how complex it is to compose such policies and such. And with Clinton, it hurt her in the run because, again, as you said, the vast majority of Americans don't understand how complex politics can be, and they're not willing to sit for 2 hours and 3 hours of her explaining such policy and how it's going to work and such, and it will bore them to death, which is what attracted Trump supporters, because Trump was able to just say in a simple sentence, this is how it's going to get done, we're going to do this, build the wall, we're going to cut this and such this, and it was just so easy for them to just be able to attract, whereas Clinton took a little more time and it bored Americans essentially.
He talks about something called WTOE 5 News, which doesn't exist. So they ended up having this website, and it ended up having a Facebook page, and it was there that this fake news said that the Pope endorsed Donald Trump. And subsequently what he said was that fake news story, if you want to now use it, so in favor of Donald Trump, he said it was circulated more than 1 million times on Facebook. It says, winning the honor as the single most circulated fake story of the entire election. And so ironic that you have Trump, who constantly goes after fake news. The biggest fake news story of the election is something that helps him. And so sort of the irony of the situation. And so we only have a few minutes left. What do you think of this book?
I definitely recommend this book to an audience that is looking for a more broader, a wholer truth of just how Trump was able to gain his momentum and in winning this election, and just realizing that it didn't start with Trump himself. It was in such a building of over decades of things that I wasn't even aware of, with such as his businesses, which is something I was not knowledgeable, and realizing how his business is intertwined with his campaign as well.
Yeah, I think it's a very good book. It certainly doesn't make Donald Trump look like a good businessman, or his family, or his son-in-law doesn't come across particularly well because of the stupid decisions he made from a business point of view, and how he was planning to lose a lot of money. And suddenly with Trump winning the White House, the son-in-law's business is going to do well. And so what you end up seeing is, and we didn't even get around to talking about it, is a lot about how absolutely terrible at business Donald Trump is. But in a broader sense, this is a very well thought out book by a Republican who worked for a loyal, from a loyal point of view of a Republican administration. We'd both recommend, if you want to have a good book on the Trump presidency, this is it. Thank you for joining us today.